They called it healing, but to witness it was to watch a man vanish beneath the weight of his own screams. No soft gowns, no sterile tools, no gentle sedatives to numb the soul. Only rusted iron, blood-soaked linen, and the flickering light of a tallow candle dancing against ancient stone walls. This was not surgery. This was survival-barely, in the shadowed chambers of medieval infirmaries. The line between doctor and butcher blurred with unsettling ease. Physicians revered and feared, wielded their tools like ritual instruments, guided not by science, but by texts, copied from text scrolls of Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, filtered through centuries of translation errors and theological tampering. And yet, amid the brutality, there lingered something else, a whisper of forgotten brilliance, of knowledge buried deeper than the corpses in plague pits. To understand what surgery meant in the medieval world, we must first forget what it means. To us now, there was no anesthesia, at least, not in the sense we understand it. No ether, no chloroform, no gas to deliver merciful unconsciousness. Pain was not merely endured, it was expected, embraced, offered up as penance, even proof of one's spiritual alignment. The deeper the agony, the closer the soul crept to redemption or madness. Yet pain alone was never the only risk. Infection lurked in every gesture. Surgeons, often barbers by trade, carried blades that had touched dozens of bodies without ever once being boiled. Blood pooled freely, not only on the straw-covered floors, but in the hands of saints. For this too was divine work, or so it was believed. The body was a temple, but not one to be preserved. It was a battlefield upon which sin, disease, and divine judgment clashed. Still, in the midst of this chaos, there were moments that defy modern explanation. Take, for example, the trepanation of the skull. Act as horrifying as it sounds. Surgeons bored holes into the cranium to release evil spirits or reduce cranial pressure. It sounds primitive, even insane, and yet, we've uncovered medieval skulls, some over 700 years old, showing signs of healing around the trepanation site. They lived. Somehow. We think of these practices as barbaric, and they were, but they were not without order. There was method in the madness. Tools were categorized and assigned roles. The lancet for bloodletting, the bone saw for amputations, the iron probe for searching inside wounds. The cautery, iron heated until it glowed, was the final judgment, sealing the flesh not with stitches, but with fire. But here's where things grow stranger. Hidden in the margins of 12th century manuscripts, buried beneath diagrams of humors and herbal tinctures, are sketches of devices that should not have existed: rotating hinges for artificial limbs, pressured riven syringes, even what some historians interpret as rudimentary anesthesia masks fashioned from bladders and hollow reeds. Are these the hallucinations of monks starved of sunlight, or echoes of something older, something lost? The Trotula texts, for instance, a compendium of women's medicine attributed to a mysterious figure named Trota of Salerno, describe pain mixtures far more sophisticated than their time suggests. Mandrake, henbane, opium, and vinegar combined in proportions that hint at a knowledge of dosage, not superstition, chemistry. Yet, after the church seized control of Salerno's medical school, these texts were altered, softened, and eventually dismissed as myth. Why? Because pain had become a doctrine. To suffer was to purge, to scream was to sanctify, and any effort to eliminate pain was seen as resisting divine will. Still, not all subscribed to this holy agony. In the East, Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon the classical knowledge abandoned by the West. Al-Zdarawi, a 10th century Andalusian surgeon, wrote detailed guides on performing complex surgeries with minimal trauma procedures that wouldn't reappear in European medical texts for another 400 years. His writings crossed into Europe via Sicily and Spain, where they were copied, fragmented, misattributed, and often censored. Yet clues remain. At the heart of every medieval hospital, whether in Paris, York, or Constantinople, was not merely a ward, but a chapel. The body and soul were treated together. But for some, the chapel was also a vault of hidden texts, diagrams, and scrolls smuggled from the East. In these forgotten corners, some physicians did more than pray. They experimented, quietly, secretly, and sometimes successfully. In 1310, an unnamed surgeon in Bologna documented the successful amputation of a soldier's leg using preparation derived from poppy resin and wine-soaked gauze. The patient did not lose consciousness, but drifted into what the text describes as a divine sleep, undisturbed by the blade. The recipe missing. The rest of the manuscript burned during an ecclesiastical purge. Coincidence, or censorship even? The tools themselves carried secrets. A recently unearthed surgical kit near Lübeck, Germany, dated to the late 13th century, contained not only iron blades and bone clamps, but a small compartment filled with powdered resin, honey, and what analysis confirmed was crushed willow bark, the same plant from which modern aspirin is derived. They knew, not in the way we know, but they knew enough to numb the pain, enough to close the wound, enough to silence the body, not the soul. Still, the question lingers: who were these doctors? Really, Many were not formally educated. Some couldn't read Latin, yet they inherited knowledge passed down orally, through apprenticeships and guild secrets. Others were monks, scribes, or wanderers from the East, whose methods blurred the boundaries between medicine, magic, and mysticism. And others still were women healers working in the shadows of convents, kitchens, and forests, many of whom were later branded witches. They healed with roots, with fermented elixirs, with chants and prayers layered in coded language. One such woman, Hildegard of Bingen, compiled vast volumes of healing lore, herbal cures, psychological therapies, even embryological charts. Her work was venerated in her lifetime, then buried beneath centuries of patriarchal revisionism. We are left with fragments, manuscripts with missing pages, tools with unknown functions, recipes with unmeasured doses, and beneath it all, silence. But silence, like scar tissue, tells its own story. So when we picture a medieval surgery, iron hook prying open flesh, a cautery rod pressed to bone, a man screaming into the void, we must also imagine what came before the scream. A whispered prayer, a crushed root, a flash of knowledge passed from hand to trembling hand, preserved not in books, but in blood. Because what they feared most wasn't death. It was forgetting. And what we fear most, perhaps, without knowing, that they remembered something we no longer understand. What if they knew more than they let on? Not in terms of theory or scientific method, but something deeper. A tactile knowledge, passed from healer to apprentice, not through books, but touch. A way of sensing the body's pain, measuring its responses by numbers, but by pulse, breath, silence. The kind of knowing that dies when the last person who holds it is burned, hanged, or simply forgotten. In a monastery outside Prague, under a crypt sealed since the 14th century, archaeologists unearthed a strange clay tablet, not religious, not a scripture, a surgical diagram, inked in ochre and soot. It showed the human body not as we see it in anatomy books, but as a constellation. Nerves traced like stars, pressure points marked like planets, and at the center, scrawled in Latin, dolor est lingua corporis, pain is the language of the body. But who spoke that language? In the courts of Europe, the physician was often a courtier, more philosopher than Dr. Educede, in Greek thought, but distanced from the blood-soaked floor of the operating room. The actual cutting was done by others, barbers, military surgeons, battlefield improvisers. They had no license to theorize, only to act, to saw through bone, to clamp open ribs, to pray their patient didn't bleed out before the sun rose. And so, medicine became a paradox. The higher minds denied, pain called it divine. The working hands knew better. Pain was real, and if you didn't learn to manage it, you didn't survive. Enter the herb women, the forest witches, the forgotten pharmacologists of medieval Europe. They knew the land, and they knew the body. They brewed poppy and mandrake into wines that induced trance. They packed open wounds with garlic, moss, and cobwebs. Primitive, yes, but often more effective than the approved salves of university-trained men. And yet, these women were hunted. Not for their failures, but for their success. The church feared what it could not control, especially when that control was threatened by a midwife's hand that stilled a fever, or a widow's tincture that made childbirth survivable. To relieve suffering without prayer, that bordered on heresy. To do it without permission, with witchcraft. But pain never cared who administered the cure. In the East, meanwhile, pain was treated as both medical and metaphysical. Persian texts describe surgical rooms perfumed with frankincense and rosewater, not merely for scent, but for their calming effect. Indian Ayurvedic treatises speak of surgical interventions conducted with herbal sedation, years before the West acknowledged such methods. In China, acupuncture charts mapped the body's pain points with an accuracy that baffled later European doctors. Knowledge flourished, but only where it was allowed to live. And still in Europe, the knife ruled. Take the case of the medieval battlefield surgeon. He carried no anesthesia, no sterilization, no hope of rest. His tools were iron, bone, fire. Yet the most valued among them weren't the ones who cut the fastest but those who whispered before they did, who gave the patient honey wine to dull the senses, who used pressure on the neck, wrists, or temples to trigger momentary unconsciousness, who knew, somehow, how to make the mind retreat before the blade arrived. Modern science calls this impossible. Yet even now, in extreme trauma, the brain can enter a fugue state, shutting down memory, numbing pain, even disassociating entirely. The ancients didn't need neuroscience to understand this. They only needed to witness it. But what if some went further? In 1327, a letter surfaced in northern Italy, written in code. It describes a sleep draft that mimics death, administered by a physician to a condemned man awaiting amputation. The man did not wake until 3 days later, his leg gone, but his mind intact. The church called it sorcery. The physician disappeared. Then there's the lost sponge, a mysterious tool mentioned in texts from Spain, Syria, and Byzantium. A sea sponge, soaked in opium, mandrake, hemlock, and other sedatives, dried, stored, and rehydrated just before surgery. When held under the nose, it was said to induce a sleep deep enough for incision, but shallow enough for survival. Sponges survive today. Only the legend. Were these early anesthetics, or fragments of something older? Some scholars trace the lineage of these methods, not to medieval Europe, but to Egypt, Babylon, even to the mythic ruins of Göbekli Tepe, where carved stone tablets show figures with elongated heads, lying prone, surrounded by tools, ceremony, sacrifice, or surgery. The Greeks inherited this legacy. So did the Arabs. And, piecemeal, the Europeans did too, not without alteration. As texts moved west, they were edited, sanitized, depowered. By the time Galen reached Paris, he had been stripped of half his nuance. By the time Avicenna's Canon of Medicine was translated into Latin, its chapters on anesthesia were missing. Intentional, accidental, perhaps both. Even the architecture of medieval healing is revealing. Hospitals like Hôtel Dieu in Paris or St. Bartholomew's in London weren't built like clinics. They were cathedrals of suffering, long communal halls where patients lay side by side, bleeding, wailing, praying. The surgeon walked among them like a priest in a ritual of agony. Pain was public, and yet, those who survived often spoke not of torment, but of visions, of angels, of floating, of silence descending like a fog. It's tempting to dismiss this as hallucination. But what if it wasn't? What if, in the extremity of pain, in the edge between death and survival, the mind accessed something else? Not heaven, not hell, but memory, deep memory, cellular memory, the kind passed down not in words, but in instinct. In this sense, surgery wasn't just healing, it was initiation. The body, cracked open to release, not just blood, but truth. Perhaps this is why medieval doctors feared silence more than screams. Pain could be measured by sound. Silence could not, and it's in that silence that the real questions lie. What knowledge did we lose when we silenced the healers? Of the forest, what wisdom was buried when pain became holy? What methods faded not because they failed, but because they worked too well? The archives are mostly gone. The tools rusted, the names erased. But beneath the layers of dogma and fear, a different medicine once lived. A medicine that did not deny pain, but did not bow before it either. A medicine that used fire and iron, yes, but also dreams, herbs, rituals, and something older than science. Attention. To touch the body with intention is to enter a contract. To open it without anesthesia is to gamble with the soul. And yet, some gambled. And today, we look back with horror. But perhaps we should also look back with humility. Because for all our progress, we still don't understand pain. Not fully, we numb it, we fear it, we drown it in drugs. But the ancients, they listened to it. And if we listened to, what might it tell us? The answer may not lie in the bones of the dead, but in the questions they left behind. Are you ready for what comes next? Because the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. There's a passage in an obscure 15th century surgical manual, written in fading ink on sheepskin parchment, that reads, "When the knife enters the body, the soul takes flight. But if it returns altered." The surgeon who wrote those words, Brother Emmerich of St. Benoit, wasn't famous. His name doesn't appear in the medical canons of the time. But his tools, discovered centuries later, buried beneath the cloister floor, suggest something unusual. Not just bone saws and cautery irons, but carved wooden figurines, soaked in resin, a linen blindfold with charcoal runes, a wax tablet etched with a spiral symbol scholars still can't decipher. These were not instruments of modern medicine. These were relics of a different kind of surgery, one that walked a line between healing and invocation. What was being invoked? We often forget how deeply spiritual pain was in the medieval world. To suffer was to be seen by God. To bleed was to purge sin. And to endure the knife without crying out, that was saintly. Martyrs were canonized, not for dying quickly, but for suffering beautifully. So in this climate, what kind of person chose to cut? It took more than courage. It took faith, but not always in religion. Some medieval surgeons believed that the human body was not just a physical vessel, but a coded system, one that could be unlocked, if one knew where to look. They spoke of humors not just as fluids, but as frequencies. The liver hummed in grief, the stomach twisted in fear, the heart remembered, and memory, they believed, could be trapped inside the flesh. There are cases, rare troubling, of patients who, mid-surgery, began speaking in other voices, describing events they had never lived, naming names no one had uttered. Some physicians wrote it off as delirium, others whispered of possession. But one account, written by a nun scribe in Ghent, suggested something different. She described a boy whose arm was being amputated after a farming injury. As the blade cut deep, he began reciting passages from a Roman text he had never read. Not just the words, but the cadence, the tone. When asked afterward, he remembered none of it. But his voice, the nun wrote, was not his own. It was older, she said, and it carried weight. We cannot prove these stories, but they persist. Across time, across cultures, somewhere between agony and unconsciousness, something opened. Even today, in clinical settings, we observe what's called the pain threshold breach, a moment where pain ceases to be a signal and becomes a state. Patients report hallucinations, time dilation, even out-of-body sensations. It's rare, it's poorly understood, but it echoes what medieval healers seemed to already know, that pain, pushed far enough, can become a doorway. And not all doorways are meant to be open. Let us return, for a moment, to the infamous Les Dents Macabre frescoes, those haunting murals painted across Europe in the late Middle Ages, where skeletons lead kings, popes, and peasants alike into the afterlife. Some art historians say they were reminders of mortality. But look closer. In several versions, a figure holds a surgical blade, and in others, the skeleton isn't leading but guiding. One step ahead, one hand outstretched, as if to say, follow me through the pain. And beyond it was this metaphor. Or memory. What if these images were drawn not from imagination, but from what people actually saw in those moments on the edge? And what does this mean for the surgeons? They were feared, respected, often shunned. In many towns, barbers who performed surgeries were required by law to live outside the city walls, not because they were dirty but because they were different. They touched the body in a way others wouldn't. They crossed thresholds. In a time where the soul was believed to reside in the breath, to cut open the chest was an act of spiritual trespass, yet they did it anyway. In manuscripts recovered from the ruins of a 13th century hospital in Avignon, one surgeon writes of an operation where the patient, before losing consciousness, whispered, "The air is thick with wings." Another wrote, "He bled, but the room grew cold, though no window was open." Are these metaphors, or did they believe the soul hovered in the room? We can't know. But we do know this: the surgeons of the medieval world were not simple butchers. They were part priest, part mechanic, part mystic. And some believed that anesthesia, true anesthesia, wasn't just a chemical state, but a spiritual one. A trance, a ritual descent, to close the senses without losing the self. To silence pain without silencing life. And that's perhaps why so few dared attempt it. Because the line between anesthesia and death was razor thin. Too much opiate, and you never woke. Too little, and you screamed through the blade. Those who mastered it were rare, feared, and eventually erased. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, surgery was becoming science. Pain was no longer sacred, it was a problem to be solved. Anesthesia, when it finally emerged in the 19th century, was heralded as a triumph. And it was. But something was lost in the silence that followed. We stopped listening to pain. We began avoiding it at all costs. But pain, however, cruelly, also a signal, a warning, a memory. And those medieval healers, for all their blood and fire, understood this. They didn't run from pain, they faced it, held it, worked through it with bare hands, steady hearts, and sometimes something deeper, something we no longer fully understand. We look back now with disbelief. We wonder how they survived it, how a man could have his leg sawn off with no anesthetic, and live. But the real mystery isn't the survival. It's what they saw when the blade came down, what they whispered before the darkness came, what truths were open when the body was, because surgery without anesthesia wasn't just medical, it was metaphysical, and in that space between the scream and the silence, something ancient stirred, not superstition, not fantasy, memory, bury, not in the past, but in the body itself. And maybe, just maybe, the doctors of the Middle Ages weren't behind us, but ahead of us, in ways we've only just begun to remember. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support means the world to me. See you in the next one.